Friday afternoon. We've got something really timely to talk about that impacts everybody. It really does, and that's the subject of wine tariffs. I'm absolutely thrilled to have as my guest Ben Aneff, who first I knew as the managing partner at Tribeca Wine Merchants, but he's also the president of the U.S. Wine Trade Alliance. And just in the time that we've talked about this subject, I found him to be unbelievably knowledgeable, obviously passionate about the subject, but also knowledgeable about all of the details of tariffs. And so, Ben, I'm really thrilled that you've carved out a little slice of time for us on Friday afternoon to talk about this subject, which is literally evolving as of this morning. So welcome.
Absolutely.
So welcome to Vinous Live. And, these seminars were designed to help bring people together in this very tumultuous time that we're going through. So, we'd love to have your questions. Those are going to be all for Ben, not for me, but we'd love to have your questions. And the earlier you can give them to us, the better, the faster we can weave them into the discussion. So Ben, welcome. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of things to talk about, but maybe talk to us first about, give us the high level. There's a number of several disputes that are going on. What does an average person need to understand about tariffs and what this is really all about?
Sure. Well, the current tariffs on wine, effectively 25% on most still wine from the EU, particularly France, the UK, Germany, and Spain, those are in regards to the large civil aircraft dispute. That's the Airbus issue, where the EU was illegally subsidizing Airbus for a number of years. There's a separate risk that—
Can I just jump in for a second? So this is wine under 14% alcohol, correct?
Exactly.
And it excludes Italy. I think Italy is taxed for foodstuffs in this package, but not in wine.
Correct.
And excludes champagne as well, right?
Exactly. Right now, it is only wines under 14% from France, Germany, Spain, the United Kingdom, and it's also wines under 2 liters. So, a 3 liter doesn't come into play at the moment.
So buy your double max.
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay. I did not know that. It's a little bit of price arbitrage there, maybe. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And, okay. So that's the large civil aircraft dispute, AKA Airbus and Boeing. We'll talk about that in a second because there's some news just this morning. And then the other one is the DST issue, correct?
Exactly right.
Okay.
So effectively, the digital services tax issue is what they call the GAFA taxes: Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. And it's where countries from the European Union are trying to figure out a way to put taxes in place on the services in their own countries. So for instance, if Google is making money on products they're using in France right now, they may not pay any tax on it. But the way that those taxes have been implemented, the US says, are discriminatory against US businesses, because effectively right now, there are size limitations, right? You have to do $750 million in revenue or more, something along those lines. So the only digital services companies that sort of come into play are those from the United States. There were 2 investigations. As you probably all know, an investigation into France's digital services tax already came back. They were declared discriminatory, and that was the threatened tariff on champagne. And then you had the famous Macron-Trump handshake. Luckily, at this point, they have not put in place tariffs on wine as a part of that. They have put in retaliatory tariffs on other products. However, right now, there is an investigation into, quote unquote, all of the other digital services taxes. And so that means Italy, Austria, Spain, Indonesia. They're in investigation right now, which means they haven't completely declared them to be discriminatory, but it is almost certain that they will be declared discriminatory, and we'll have a ruling in the next 2 to 4 months. And then we'll have a list of proposed retaliatory tariffs. We would imagine, I think some of those countries produce wine. I can't remember. You'll have to remind me, Antonio. And we would certainly expect wine is at real risk from that investigation.
Yeah, for sure. So what we're the thing that is the most pressing right now is that comments are open right now to the public up until July 26th, so in 2 days, on the Airbus Boeing dispute, where the tariffs, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a layperson's perspective. And thank you for all the work that you've done on this, because you know like 1,000 times more than I do. But from a layman's perspective, what is being considered is taking the current 25% tax and possibly increasing it as far as 100%, correct?
Effectively, in a nutshell, that's exactly right.
Okay. And so,
and by the way, Antonio, I'd also say that in the annex list they could also expand the tariffs to include sparkling wine, to include Italy, to include large format, to include wine over 14%. They can do all of that on August 12th if they so choose. And the deadline for submission on that, as you point out, is July 26th. They require an earlier submission date in order to process all of those comments, because they are required by federal law to review every single public comment.
Okay, so we've done this morning is we've sent out an email to our mailing list of, I don't know how many tens of thousands of people, but basically everybody on the Vinous list. I asked them personally to leave a comment and gave them the link, and given everybody the direct link to the new page where you can do that. So I'd urge you to do it. If you want to multitask and do it while we're on this call, please, but please leave a comment. Every comment is important. So we've done that. And of course, we've got this YouTube and Zoom call, which will become a public YouTube link as well for people who want to watch it maybe later on in the day or over the weekend. So it's just absolutely imperative that people take an opportunity to speak up, because it's obviously very important. I think what would be really interesting, Ben, is to understand what is the impact of even like a small tariff? What is the impact of a tariff? How does that work through the system? How do importers, distributors, retailers handle, let's say, the 25% tariff that is in place now? And how does that impact, let's say, I only have champagne here, so it's not the best example, but how does that impact a bottle of wine? Because it's not just that the wine is 25% more expensive, right? That 25% feeds through an entire system of markups.
Well, that's right. And to be honest, it's really complicated, because there are some states where an importer or a distributor or even a retailer may be allowed to eat a little bit of that tariff. And obviously, it's proving terribly damaging, particularly to importers and distributors, some of which have seen their sales drop by up to 50% because of the mandated closures from restaurants, right? So if you're asking a distributor, hey, don't make them, we're going to ask you to crunch your margins on your most important products at a time when your sales have collapsed by 50%, that's incredibly difficult. And these are cash-starved companies by and large. But also, there are a lot of states, Ohio is a good example, right, where there are mandatory margins that are put in place. So even if they wanted to, for instance, eat a higher percentage of the tariff, they may not even be allowed to. So it's going to be passed onto the consumer in a number of given ways. And then the other real, one of the most consequential ways that this could affect consumers is choice, because there are a whole range of importers and distributors who simply cannot afford to pay the tariffs. You have to pay them 10 days after your goods arrive. And they don't send you a bill and kindly ask you to write them a check whenever it's convenient. They have your banking information and they take the cash out of your account in 10 days. And a lot of these same distributors and importers, often by regulation, they're not even allowed to have been paid for these goods yet, right? So they're forwarding all this cash ahead of time. So quite frankly, there are a large number of distributors that simply may not be able to bring in a large number of goods that they normally would have planned to. So consumer choice is one of the most consequential ways that these tariffs impact the consumer.
Yeah, and I think there's more to that, but just to sort of really explain in a nutshell what you're talking about is you have to have a significant bank account to be able to pay those tariffs to retire goods, and then you have to sell it, obviously. And we're dealing in a world in which, for example, on-premise is essentially non-existent right now, on-premise sales. So that's 30-40% of the business. The average importer or distributor, that may be 30-40% of their business. And so and a lot of the higher end wines were specifically allocated to restaurants. So it's kind of like it's a perfect storm of liquidity crunch, right? Because you've got to pay that money, but you don't have your traditional customers for those wines. And you have to hope that retail can absorb perhaps some of the higher priced, more desirable wines. But guess what? Those retailers are getting increased offers from everybody. So they can't process, the system cannot handle this influx of those high-end wines either, I don't think. I mean, I've heard the stories of cases of very prestigious wines available at retail now that you never saw at retail. Now, obviously the market can handle some of that, but not all of that.
Absolutely right, Antonio. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
I mean, bottom line, we're in the middle of a pandemic that has vast consequences across our entire economy. So it disrupts the market in general. And when you add, both the downside risk from the unknown, what's going to happen in 3 months, what's going to happen in 6 months. Even, while there are some retailers that are doing really well, there's some that are really, really, really struggling. They're also not certain that they're going to have all of their customers there for them to immediately pick up some of these wines. And it's a lot of unknown with a lot of downside risk and not much upside. So it's problematic, to say the least.
So I think, obviously in a perfect world, I think everybody would like to see free trade and no tariffs, no subsidies of any kind. I think one of the misconceptions around tariffs is that on these EU products is that it will increase the consumption of US wines, of domestic wines. But I see some of the people that you've mentioned, distributors and importers, I mean, they obviously depend on the infrastructure of these imported goods to support their businesses at a top level. And isn't it true that if you don't have those revenues, you're going to have to let go some of the people who help you sell domestic wines too, correct? Explain how that works.
Absolutely right. I mean, there's sort of a reality that even most US domestic producers have a very good understanding of, and that's that these wines, particularly, still wines from France, these are keystone species in our world. And they bring the liquidity to allow distributors to invest in lesser known wines. And by and large, most US producers are small mom and pop wine producers. 80% of US domestic producers are, I think, under 5,000 cases, something like that. They have no name. People don't know them. A sommelier at a restaurant, when they were still up and running, wasn't saying, my customers are demanding X, Y, and Z Chardonnay from California or Oregon. A retailer was saying the same. There aren't a lot of brands like that, which meant that in order for domestic producers to have access to market, for them to get their wines on the important wine lists in New York, Chicago, Houston, Dallas, in great retail stores around their country, to get the consumer-facing part of the wine business to sell their wines, they need distributors to make investments in them. They need them to believe in them. They need them to have the capacity and the capital to get their sales reps behind these wines, to teach them, not to mention to pay for the wines and take a bit of a risk on them, because in most cases, they're sort of unknown in the beginning. And this is one of the reasons why, by the way, effectively every major domestic producer organization has come out strongly against the tariffs on wine from the EU, all the way down the line. And we have seen, by the way, we already have the data from Global Trade Atlas and other places that these tariffs have not, for instance, increased imports of wine from other markets like south of the equator and that sort of thing. And we also know that by and large, U.S. domestic producers have not seen much, if any, additional sales from these. If anything, you have U.S. distributors that are now going to U.S. producers and saying, I've got to pay you less money for your wine now. We simply don't have the cash flow at what you'd previously been asking. And as you know, it's an incredibly expensive proposition to open a U.S. producer. You have a lot of upfront costs that people don't have in Europe. Maybe if you're in Sancerre, your great grandfather gifted you the vines. That's not the way it works in California. I heard the real estate's expensive there. I'm not sure. I haven't checked Zillow recently, but
yeah, for sure, it's harder. So, you mentioned something just a few seconds ago that I think is really interesting. So, the first tariffs, the 25% tariffs, those were enacted when exactly?
The first round, they went into place in mid-October
of last year. Exactly
right.
And so what have you been able to observe? I mean, obviously you have a shop, so you have anecdotal evidence, but then you have the collective evidence that some of which you've just cited. What was the impact of that first round, which was 25%?
A great question. And you know what? I think some of the most powerful evidence that we had was because, as you know, you sort of want to do it in a vacuum, and the pandemic has created these variables that make it a little bit more difficult to sort of ascertain what's happened. But prior to the pandemic, so let's say November 2019, the tariffs are fully in place. There's not really a scare of pandemic yet anywhere in the world. We know that France exported essentially 50% less wine to the United States in the affected categories. So the US bought half what they typically do. Now, usually the US would say, well, that's great, because that means this is going to influence France to, and the European Union in general, to solve this Airbus issue, because their producers won't be able to sell their products, et cetera. Unfortunately, even though the exports to the US dropped by half, their overall exports in the same month actually went up. They simply sold them elsewhere. I think, exports to China rose by 35 points in a month. I mean, as you know, particularly the, historic regions of Europe, it's hard for them to expand production. There are a lot of, climate change related problems that means they're making a little bit less wine anyway. So there's demand all over the world in expanding markets, and they simply took from our bucket and sold it elsewhere.
Right. So that creates an issue, because you're talking about highly allocated small production wines, which are the wines that we all love to drink when we have a chance, when we're fortunate enough to do so. And it would seem to me anyway, from where I see, that those allocations may never come back. And so back to the US. And that could threaten the survival of these companies.
You're killing me, Antonio. You're killing me.
Why? I'm just trying to understand the situation, because it's not what I deal with day to day. I'm like
know.
A guy who tastes wine.
You're speaking to my fears. You're killing me, man. I rely on these wines.
This is above my pay grade. I'm trying to understand it for myself, but that's what I worry about, which is that these wines that maybe this year, let's say pre-pandemic, October, November 2019, they get sold to another country, and then next year, which is now, maybe some of these countries that may be in a bit better shape than we are, at least today, as we're talking on July 24th, they may say, hey, I want to get the same allocation I got last year. And
exactly right. That, especially if this continues very long, when importers and distributors start dropping wines for whatever reason, or start reducing their allocations, it is not a given that they're going to come back to us. And I remember, and I can point to, I'm not going to on right this moment, but I'll tell you, after this Zoom call, I remember fine, extraordinary producers of Burgundy where the allocations were significantly reduced during the financial collapse, 2008, 2009, and they did not come back. And I wonder what other producers, could potentially be at risk with that same sort of thing. I mean, look, this was going to be a concern of people like me, people in the fine and rare business, and people that we're really hopeful no one knows about these other wines because we're so passionate about them. But unfortunately, word spreads, other markets want them, and this is just exacerbating that problem. I mean, we always knew that collectors around the world were coming for really coveted allocations of wines that the US had strongly supported for a very long time. And we were sort of fighting a rearguard action to, continue our really important allocations, but it's getting more and more and more difficult. And I hear it I've been hearing this problem from, wine consumers for a long time. I remember when I was able to get 12 bottles down the line of every Grand Cru and every Premier Cru I want. And then we come back and say, we can offer you 2 or 3 bottles. I mean, I'm sure you've sensed this exact sort of problem, and the tariff issue is only going to exacerbate it.
Mm. What about just peeling back the onion a little bit? A lot of importers have their own DI relationships where they import some wines directly, and then they may have others that they represent, not as a distributor or whatever, not directly. So doesn't that it would seem to me that creates a potential for there to also be if you're struggling for survival, you're going to just focus on your core labels or brands or projects or whatever they may be, and maybe some of the smaller or lesser known or wineries where you don't have as good an economic relationship,
right,
may drop, right?
It's a real problem. You're exactly right. I mean, a dozen producers come up in mind that are really passionate, that are really fabulous. And it's not always just the producer. Sometimes the distributor may simply not be in a position from a cash flow perspective to be able to bring in, for instance, even one bottle of wine that they have not yet pre-confirmed. And that's different. We're getting more and more emails like that. Please get your pre-orders in. We are not bringing in a single bottle that we have not pre-confirmed. We're not planning on stocking anything. And that again speaks to this problem of, if US distributors aren't buying those wines and those wines go to other markets, when we come back in 2 years and say, congratulations, Europe, we're back on track, let's go ahead and double our allocations. That's just not the way that may work. Those wines may have gone to other markets with savvy buyers themselves who say, look, we're going to take these wines now, but we want confirmation that we're going to be able to continue to get these strong allocations going forward.
Yeah. So what I've heard is at 25%, that the market can kind of figure out a way to deal with 25%, at least in the short term. But what is the number at which people just say, I can't afford to bring that in because I know I can't sell it?
I think if 25% continues for very long, you're going to see real major consequences on benchmark distributors and importers that
Really?
At 35 points, every single distributor is going to stop bringing in wines that you know and love. There are going to be wines that you are passionate about, that you can't even imagine aren't being brought into the US. And 35 points is really that number. You can sort of look at it, in an inverse way on, the markets that used to buy wine from the United States abroad. And for instance, you saw the surge going to Hong Kong, right? When they dropped their tariff rate from 25 points. 25 points is incredibly significant. And so markets that have anything over 25 points really can't participate in the market for for wines from the European Union. It's especially quote unquote commodity wines where you can look on Wine Searcher and see it's X price in the UK or X price everywhere else in the world, and now it's X plus 35 points here. That's hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, these savvy collectors will just buy that wine in London, right? And they'll store it somewhere and then ship it over when it's at some other point in time.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of what's been announced today, what is the impact of all of these restaurant auctions that are happening to the US wine market? Like this right now, today, I think it's Del Posto, it's something like 30,000 bottles that are being auctioned. But we've seen really significant auctions from Le Bernardin and from Danny Meyer's group. So when that amount of wine enters the market of mature-ish, let's say, call it ready to drink wines, how does that, what does that do to your business, to your colleagues' businesses? Does it have an impact, or?
It's hard to say right now. I can't say that I've noticed one yet because, as you know, most of these wines are really rare, and or a lot of them are pretty difficult to find. But the other issue is because these auctions are happening in the summer, and the summer is a much slower time particularly for auction season, right? We haven't seen the results of both the influx of some supply from fine and rare wines from restaurants, and we haven't seen all the results of the pandemic, et cetera, sort of work itself into market pricing. I think once we hit September, October, we'll have a lot better idea of that. From an anecdotal perspective, our store, we have had a few really great sellers come in, and typically the wines that are going to sell immediately and they'll sell in a day, and then there's some others that will take a little bit longer, but it's tough to say. What I'd say is, I think we'll know a lot more in September and October.
Got it. So let's talk about, obviously this is a situation that's constantly changing, and just this morning there's some news out of Europe, out of Airbus, that they've offered to repay some of the loans. What do you make of that?
It's a great question. I mean, this morning there was an announcement from the EU suggesting they're coming into compliance with the Airbus case. The headline is fabulous. Unfortunately, what we all would have expected would have been a joint press conference from the US and the EU, where the EU is saying, we have been discussing this with the United States, and you have the US trade representative come out and say, this issue has been resolved. We did have some communications with USTR this morning, and they were totally surprised by the announcement. So it was unilateral, and they weren't working with the US trade representative to say, look, this is what we're doing. Is this going to satisfy your thoughts on this issue and bring the EU into compliance officially? So that's not the case at this point. So it's the EU also said, by the way, now that we are in compliance in our view, we reserve the right to tariff the United States in relationship to the related Boeing matter when the expected award for that matter is published in the next 60 or 90 days, which if the US doesn't, it could complicate matters. To say the least. But the USTR right now is reviewing what the EU is stating that they're doing, and we look forward to hearing from the USTR and to see how the administration responds to this.
Yeah, so it certainly seems like it certainly seems like a step in the positive direction, but obviously the devil's in the details, and so who knows exactly. I mean, I haven't had a chance to read it; it just came out this morning. But what exactly it means. But I'll tell you, one of my fears is, and I've seen this with some of your colleagues, is that there's a kind of a sense of complacency among some people, the feeling like, well, we're in a global pandemic, we're not going to raise tariffs right now. And I hope those people who have that view are right, but I don't share it. I just think you don't want to let your guard down now. And we're sort of at the finish line on this commenting process. It's really important that people submit a comment. And also this news on Airbus really only relates to the large aircraft dispute. It's completely unrelated to DST and any other things that may develop subsequently, correct?
Couldn't have said it better, Antonio. The thought that we can't do anything is what happened in August of 2019. Every other major industry in the world, when the federal government says, we are looking at your products, snaps into attention. It took us a little while to sort of come around, largely because, look, we're mostly mom and pop businesses. We have 400,000 employees, but instead of 10 or 12 huge mega companies, we have 47,000 retailers, 6,500 distributors and importers. So the vast majority of these are small family-owned businesses. It's easy to say, gosh, what can we do? So luckily, we're in a much better position now. We're significantly better organized than we were. But yes, to your point on DST, for instance, when you have major industry working with the federal government to influence policy, they don't celebrate until every single I is dotted and T is crossed, and we're a long way from that happening. We really hope that this is the step in the right direction that we need on the large civil aircraft matter, but we have to keep the pedal to the metal, keep applying pressure to the U.S. Trade Representative, to Congress in general, and to let them know how disproportionately damaging these tariffs are, mostly to small family-owned businesses here in the United States.
Yeah, and then by extension to those sorts of companies, the jobs are middle-class jobs at those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
I mean, these are these are jobs of middle-class families that are at risk here.
You couldn't have put it better.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of questions that I want to ask you while we're on these topics. One is from David. When we were talking about alcohol, is it 14% under 14% or 14% and under?
Under 14%.
Okay, so up to 13.9 basically.
Exactly. Exactly. It's not a romantic point that the USTR didn't go, we don't like, or we like high alcohol wines and we don't like low alcohol wines. It's just related to a specific customs code. Same thing with the large format issue.
Yeah, and my understanding, because I remember being at Chateau Latour, no, was it Margaux? Well, I wasn't there. I was there on Zoom. But
you're there in spirit.
Yeah, but they told me that the French laws only allow labeling in 0.5% increments. So that is it's under 14, but in practical purposes, it's 13.5 on a label if the winemaker was correct, and I would trust that he's correct. But basically, it's under 14%. Okay, and then from Douglas, Ben, you mentioned August 12th as a date that new tariffs might be announced. Is that a date of announcement or a date of effect? Because, as you recall, in the fall, one of the things that happened is a lot of people have, at that time of year especially, a lot of people have containers on the water, and people were caught with wine that was already shipped, that they had already committed to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the August 12th date is what's called the carousel date, which is set in place by the Section 301 laws. They're required to, quote unquote, do a new carousel every 180 days. It's less clear if they are allowed to put the tariffs in place by that day. The announcement should be right on that day, but typically it takes between 14 and 21 days for Customs and Border Patrol to actually put in place the new tariff mechanisms and whatnot. So for instance, the last carousel date was February 14, and I believe they started actually collecting the tariffs on something like March 5th. Okay. I think it was about 20 days in all the last go round, but the likelihood is that they won't start collecting on August 12th or August 13th, but they would start collecting and put, say, between 14 and 21 days later.
Okay, so yeah, so I mean, obviously, if you've got anything that's shipping it, within anything that is due to arrive within 2 to 3 weeks after August 12th, that's a cause for concern. Is you may, if
you
the
are
tariff changed, if the tariffs change on August 12th, and you've got
exactly
something
right.
2 to 3 weeks after that, you're in the window of maybe having to deal with something that was unanticipated.
Exactly right.
Yeah, and that could be 100%. It could be 25%. Who knows?
And it could be on something that's not tariffed at the moment, like Italy.
Okay. All right. So this is obviously a pretty big concern. We have a comment from Zach that it's 14% alcohol and under. So I'm going to ask my office to see if we can look this up while we're on the phone.
Yeah, that may be correct. Generally, everybody is either way over or way under. not quite, but okay. Yeah, that may be right.
So I apologize if we got that wrong, but we're going to try to get some a specific answer. Dale asks, when will this recording be posted? We post these immediately to YouTube. So literally it's as soon as the video processes, but I mean, it's really just usually a matter of minutes after the session is over. It goes on right away. We don't do any editing or processing of it more than whatever YouTube requires. Ben, what else should people be aware of?
Well, the next big threat, for instance, even if this, in a magical world where the large civil aircraft case is completely resolved, we still have a pretty concerning digital services tax issue. And that's the Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon tax. There had been an organization that was arranging negotiations between the United States and Europe on this issue. Effectively, most digital services tax companies in the US have said, we acknowledge that we're going to need to pay some type of tax in Europe on the services that we provide there. It's the way they've been put in place that they believe are discriminatory towards the US. There were negotiations going on in what's called the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Unfortunately, the US has withdrawn from those negotiations in the last 30 days. Most of the European countries have said, look, we've sort of put a hold on collecting these taxes because you all have told us you're going to negotiate on them. But they are all going to start coming into effect in 2021. And if the United States isn't negotiating on them, and Europe does start to collect these taxes, the United States has said they will retaliate. So the next risk is going to be the DST investigation into Italy, Spain, Austria, et cetera. And we would certainly expect that wine from all of those countries would be on the proposed tariff list, and they'll certainly mark it up, or they'll at least propose it up to a very high percentage point. So it will be important at that point. There would be an open comment period similar to what there is now. It's also possible that there would be a hearing, because it's, typically there would be at the conclusion of an investigation and the initial round of proposed tariffs, similar to the hearing that was in January of this past year on the champagne case, where you had about a very large showing from the wine industry. It's possible there won't be a hearing because of the pandemic at the moment, but there would be an open comment period. It would be really, really important at that point, to have the wine industry and the, passionate wine consumers again contact the USTR and their elected officials in Congress to tell them that this is not an effective way to bring the EU into compliance on these issues. In a nutshell, the issue is we understand that the USTR has a right and is supposed to be protecting US interests abroad. But because of the way prohibition works, tariffs on wine do significantly more financial harm to businesses here in the US than they do overseas. Actually, for every dollar of economic harm these tariffs inflict on the EU, they inflict about $4.52, I believe, is now the number on businesses here in the United States, which makes them an ineffective way to bring the EU into compliance. There's a little anecdote I use to explain it. You can walk into a Chanel store in Dallas. You can be walking into a French-owned retail store. The distribution can be French. The manufacturer can be French. You could walk into a Zara in Chicago with an EU-owned retailer. Distribution is EU-owned. Manufacturer is EU-owned. You cannot do that in the wine business in the United States. When you buy a bottle, there's no such thing as a Dom Perignon wine store. You are walking into a U.S. retail store, almost certainly a small business, a small family-owned business. They are buying from a U.S. distributor. Again, mostly small, even the famous distributors and importers are small family-owned businesses. 6,500 of them in the U.S. employ about 180,000 people. They're buying from a U.S. importer who's only then buying from the manufacturer. So it's not fair to, and it's not efficient when you're putting tariffs on products that do more economic harm here in the U.S. than overseas.
Yeah, I want to come back to that for a second, but first I want to thank Thomas for some excellent comments here, and I'm going to read them just because I want to make sure I don't get this wrong. He cites a measure of the code here, which says, with respect to tariffs, this measure did not apply to wines over 14% alcohol or to sparkling wines. And then he points out, to your point, Ben, that the basis for that is that wines from 11 to 14% are table wines. This is a tax code thing. That's why you see a lot of those gray market labels that say 11 to 14. The basis for that is that wines from 11 to 14 are table wines, and over 14% is considered dessert wine for the purposes of computing taxes and duties, not necessarily from a gustatory.
Right. I would tell everybody that basically we're saying everybody's going to 13.9 or it's 14.1 and above, outside of those gray market labels. But gray market is another discussion that we can talk about in a very long time.
But this is a question, again, from Thomas, that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds, which is, why are trade issues in travel and digital services industries being addressed through wine, which seems to be completely unrelated?
It's a great question. It's an easy target. There are people in positions of authority who associate Europe with wine, and they associate Europe with cheese. So it's a flashy thing. For instance, the digital services tax threat in December. We're going to put 100% tariff on champagne. It's flashy. It's headline grabby. Wine is less than 1% of France's exports, so or GDP, one of the two. But bottom line, it's not the big influencer that, for instance, Airbus is. Airbus is a massive mover. It's incredibly influential from a political perspective there. That's the reason they were receiving staggering levels of illegal subsidies. So that's our point, is that putting tariffs on these products are ineffective at influencing the EU. But the reason they're doing it is because, what they would tell you is they want to see, winemakers in Europe go up in arms and start protesting and get the European Commission to take these, to take the tariffs off of Airbus, or to take the tariffs, or to come to some kind of agreement on the digital services tax issue.
Yeah. Obviously, wine, cheese, pasta, prosciutto, these things are iconic.
Exactly.
I think it's more of the icon status as opposed to the economic relationship of value.
Right. I would also point out that, that was a very good comment, and it is new. This is not typically the way the US would have responded in these situations. Even the Section 301 process that we're in, where the US Trade Representative can, without congressional approval, unilaterally put in place tariffs on products to punish a company. Even though the Section 301 tariffs have been put in place since the 70s, presidents don't do that typically, or administrations don't. The Office of the US Trade Representative, that's not the way in either Democratic or Republican administrations. They would have always usually worked through Congress when they were putting tariffs in place on products. So that's actually a complaint that quite a number of people in Congress have, is that they've usurped congressional authority here. You know, I would point out, for instance, you know, Cory Gardner from Colorado, actually, I believe, voted against confirming the U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer because of his concern of this exact thing, that the U.S. Trade Representative might put unilateral tariffs in place on products without any oversight from Congress.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's really interesting. I want to read you a comment from Allison, because I think it's really, it's going to be of great interest to everybody, and it's a little lengthy, so I don't want to get it wrong. So I'm just going to read this from Allison. She asks, is there a website or place where consumers and trade can access data about the economic impacts of the wine industry to the U.S. economy, such as number of jobs, revenues, et cetera, and how the tariffs are currently impacting the business? It would be easier for business owners to communicate to their customers the realities of the situation if we had a resource with the statistics of our industry's contribution to the U.S. economy and how this impacts consumers as a whole.
It's a really great question. The WSWA did come out with just recently came out with a study, a broad economic study on how these tariffs can impact the U.S. One of the reasons it's been difficult to come up with that is because these are all private companies. They don't have to disclose their income publicly. They're loath to do so. So it's been challenging. But I'll make sure that the USWTA website has this new study updated on it. But the other thing that I would mention, when businesses are communicating to their customers, we find that short and sweet works the best. A lot of people don't quite want to get into the weeds. There are some broad talking points on the USWTA website, but letting consumers know that these tariffs could potentially rise to 100% on effectively all wine, still or sparkling, at any alcohol rate from the European Union, letting them know that that's a possibility, that Congress or that the U.S. Trade Representative is asking for the public's input on whether they think that's appropriate. That's really effective. And a couple of nutshell, big picture data points from that WSWA study was that these tariffs put 93,000 American jobs at risk and could prevent an over $11 billion loss in state and local taxes. So those are a couple of good figures that I've seen people using that have good data behind them. But I think communicating, businesses, particularly retail stores that have large consumer email lists, communicating to your customers what the risk is, letting them know that the U.S. Trade Representative is asking the public to comment on this. Submissions have to be in by July 26th. And giving them an easy one-click ability to do that is critical. We have created a portal, endwinetariffs.com, where in effectively 1 to 2 clicks, you can send a letter to the appropriate comment portal on the USTR website, as well as to your House official and both of your senators on the matter. So retail stores communicating that to their consumers very clearly and simply is a really effective way to bring the public comments that the U.S. Trade Representative is asking for.
Okay, so there's basically 2 ways that you can comment. You can go through the site that you just mentioned, and you fill out that one form, and then that does feed the USTR and your local officials, senators and Republicans comments. or you can click on the link that we sent around, which goes directly to the USTR website, and you can fill out that form. It's literally 2 screens, I think. I mean, they've changed it. So if you did this a few months ago, it looks different, but it's actually, I think, a little bit easier because it's really streamlined process to just leave a comment with your name, your email, and so on and so forth. I'm going to ask you one last question, which I'm sure is on the mind of many people. And I should say, we've had a tremendous turnout for this, which tells me that there's this is on the minds of a lot of folks, as it should be. So thanks for everybody who's watching. Doug asks, could the situation change quickly if there's a new U.S. administration, and or how likely is it to stay in place?
Great question. It's complicated. One thing that I would say before us is, the 2 major issues that are affecting this, if the large civil aircraft matter, which the U.S. claims has harmed Boeing, and the digital services tax matter, which the U.S. claims harms the mega digital services companies. Those are all democratic states. So the leadership in those states it's going to be important for them that these issues are resolved. This is not simply a Republican matter. I would also say that in the Ways and Means hearing in June, and Ways and Means is probably the most important House of Representatives committee, and it's under Democratic control. There was broad support for the trade representatives, USTR Lighthizer, work to bring the EU into compliance on the Airbus matter. So Democrats care about getting the Airbus issue resolved. They'll also care about getting the digital services tax issue involved or issue resolved. Whether, for instance, the United States might be more likely to go through the OECD negotiations that we have just pulled out of on the digital services tax matter, great question. It's hard for me to speculate. I would hope that our government is going to negotiate on these issues and try to bring this. I would hope that they understand the damage these tariffs are doing to U.S. businesses and do everything they possibly can to negotiate on this subject to get it resolved for all the parties involved. But whoever is in office, the wine industry has to take this very seriously and continue to communicate how disproportionate the damages are to small mom and pop businesses here in the United States. So whoever wins in November, whatever happens with Congress, we are going to be incredibly focused on making sure that the people in office, the people in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative understand the damage these things do.
Yeah, because obviously the focus of our chat today is about wine, but it's really EU goods. And from what I've seen, the list of goods on the DST tax is much greater, potentially. That could include things we can probably live without, like luxury goods from France or whatever, but also the things that would have a direct impact on our industry, like imported foods for restaurants that depend on olive oil, balsamic vinegar, cheeses, all sorts of things that
absolutely
that are core ingredients for a lot of restaurants in the country. Those things may become prohibitively expensive, and then that has an effect on maybe a restaurant's ability to survive during the greatest economic crisis we've had in this country since the Second World War. So there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of ripple effects. It's not just that your bottle of Sancerre or Puy-Fumé just went up. It's a lot of things.
Oh no, you're exactly right. I mean, it's hard to overstate how cruel some of these would be to the restaurant industry. I mean, the sale of wine by the glass sales are a huge critical profit center for restaurants, as you know. And typically they have very low profit margins. What's the old saying? The best way to lose $1 million, start a restaurant. But wine is a critical profit center for these areas. There's not an easily replaceable wine that offers the same kind of quality and same kind of profit for a restaurant that they really need just for their survival. It's not a luxury, it's an absolute requirement. And then absolutely right. I mean, olive oil, can you even imagine what a big tariff on olive oil would do to restaurants as well? I mean, it is a 1-2 punch to the gut of the restaurant industry right as they're trying to come to get up off the mat. It's a tremendous problem.
Yeah. So, Ben, I want to thank you for your time. But before we leave, I just want to repeat the links that people can follow, just because some people may have joined midway or whatever. The link to your organization where people can fill out a form that goes directly to the USTR, and your Congress people is what exactly?
EndWineTariffs.com.
Okay. And I looked at that, I think yesterday, the day before. You actually have a suggested text in there that people can use as a template, correct?
Exactly right. If you only have 45 seconds, you can fill out your name, your zip code. It will pre-populate a letter to an appropriate letter to the U.S. Trade Representative, as well as to all three of your elected officials in Washington, D.C. You click send and you're done.
Yeah, so that's endwinetariffs.com. You've made it as easy as possible. I did the one that goes directly to the U.S. Trade Portal, because that is the group that will actually consider this, the USTR that will actually consider these comments most directly, in my view anyway. And that is on my Instagram page as a direct link. And it's also in the email that we sent out today to our entire list, where with one click, you can go directly to the USTR portal for this Airbus Boeing civil airline aircraft dispute and leave your comment. It literally is like 2 screens. It will take you, I don't know, not less than a minute for sure. So
yeah, a huge help. And I'd like to thank Harman Skurnik for telling me not to use stoplesamareustariffs.com, because we had some misspellings there. So endwinetariffs.com, much easier to spell.
Okay, great. Well, again, I want to thank everybody who tuned in for this, which we put together sort of at the last minute, and the turnout was really huge, which means it's on the minds of a lot of people, which is fantastic. Now all we need to do is to convert all of that into some action, and to not be taken by to not think that our individual voices don't count. They count a lot when they're taken collectively. We can't be complacent. We've got to just, as you said, I don't remember exactly what you said, but you basically said press on the accelerator till we get to the finish line. So that's what we want to do. You thanked Harman. I want to thank my colleague, Josh Reynolds, who is an industry veteran and the person who this was his idea. So thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Josh.
Always been an inspiration to me in a lot of different ways. And it's thanks to him that this happened. So thanks, Josh. And thanks everyone for watching. Good luck, Ben. And please, please, please take a minute to fill out those links. Send us any comments if you'd like. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a great weekend, everyone. Ben, thanks for your time. Thanks for all of your hard work.
Thank you so much, Antonio. Really appreciate the help.
You bet. Anytime.